Welcome to the Rich, Young, and Powerful podcast. This is the place where we help average givers become everyday philanthropists. I'm your host, Andrew McNair, a financial commentator, author, nine-figure wealth manager, and a philanthropist too. I'm going to show you how to give more, how to find more fulfillment, and help you impact the causes that you care about the most. Because when a giver gives more, they receive and become more. And I am so excited to share with you our special guest, Dr. Thom Rainer. He's the CEO of Lifeway, author of multiple books, such as I'm a Church Member and the Autopsy of a Deceased Church. And he's also the founder of the Rainer Group, which is a church consulting firm that helps churches get on the right track. So I really am looking forward to sharing with you Dr. Thom Rainer's work. I think it's going to impact you if you're a church leader or if you're a pastor, because today's show is the Giving Church. And I want to share with you from a consultant, one who's wrote the book on the autopsy of a deceased church, why it is so important to become that Giving Church. So Dr. Thom Rainer, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you, Andrew. Don't do the doctor too much. I'm not the kind of doctor that can help. So we'll go with Tom, because I won't feel very comfortable if you keep the doctor thing going.
Well, Tom, I really always love to start off with people's testimonies. And so I'd love to hear who helped lead you to God first.
Well, that's really clear for me, because I was on a high school football team, which was obviously a long time ago. And my high school football coach called me into his office for what I perceived to be something I had done wrong on the football field. And as he started talking to me, I realized that he wasn't talking about football. He was very straightforward. He said, "Rainer, I think there's something missing in your life. Do I have permission to tell you about my friend Jesus?" And my high school football coach shared the gospel with me. Later that night, I became a follower of Christ and have been ever since. But there's a gap in the story. The gap is my teenage years, when I did not get really ingrained in a local church. Though a believer, I did not always follow the path of Christ consistently. And then shortly after I got married, primarily by the influence of my wife, we started attending a church. And that's when I began to really understand what it meant to be a follower of Christ. So two primary influences, really three. One, high school football coach who was bold enough to take a young kid into his office and just share the gospel with him. Two, my wife, who gently encouraged and urged me to get into church. And we were newlyweds at the time too. And then three, the church itself. And you mentioned that I wrote a book called I Am a Church Member. Those are not mere words to me. That is 1 Corinthians 12. And really all of the New Testament from Acts 2 to Revelation 3 is either about the church in the context of the church or written to the church. And those were the three primary influences that really have put me on a path where, though far, far from perfect, I have been able to draw closer to Christ and to follow him more closely.
You know, I just love hearing your story, and every testimony is so different, but to hear who planted that seed for you and how it was cultivated. And again, you mentioned Paul's letter to the Corinthians. You know, I love where, he mentions how Paul mentions how he came to the church, but someone had planted the seed first and someone had watered it. And I think that is how many testimonies are started. It's usually not just this immediate conversion. It's this testimony of someone, again, planting seed, coming back and watering, and then someone coming back again to disciple them. So I think that's very clear in your testimony.
Well, I got to tell you that Coach Joe, the man who shared the gospel with me, I actually found him about 45 years later. And there's so much to the story about our reunion. I'm not going to go into all of that, but to have the opportunity after so many years to see him again and to thank him and to honor him for what he had done. So that's another story in itself. I'll save that for another day, Andrew.
Well, the topic of today's show is going to be the Giving Church. And this is something I'm very passionate about, because you've already mentioned Acts. And in the early church, it was described as a giving church, a selfless church that was giving extraordinarily. I mean, enough for the Roman Empire to take notice that people were living with an open hand. And I would love for us to get back to that giving church. So in the book, I'm a church member, which I really enjoyed. I actually listened to it on Audible. And so I really enjoyed it. But God did, you said this in your own words, God did not give us the local church to become country clubs where membership means we have privilege and perks. No, he placed us in churches to serve, to care for others, to pray for leaders, to learn, to teach, to give, and in some cases, die for the sake of the gospel. So many churches are weak because I believe we have members who have turned on the meaning of a membership upside down, really. And it's time to get it right. So it's time to become a church member as God intended. It's time to give instead of being entitled. So a paraphrase of your words, just super strong language in that book.
Well, your words are probably better than mine. That's a really short book. And one of the reasons it's short is because I'm not very smart and I can only write a few pages at a time. And so I wrote that book in brevity. It actually started off as a blog post. And honestly, I was trying to get the blog post done because my due date was the next day. And I was rushing around trying to get it. And I wrote probably a 450-word blog post called I'm a Church Member, forgot about it. 2 days later, it had hit 1 million views. And I said, ooh, something's going on here. We've hit a nerve. And the nerve that we hit is this. What it means to be a part of the church is always focusing on the other in that self. It's focusing on God. It's focusing on others. It's focusing beyond ourselves. And that moment that we start thinking the church is about the unholy trinity of me, myself, and I is the moment that we are no longer truly church members. We are more country club or even civic club members, whichever one you want to say. And we're looking, particularly from the country club side, for what can the church do for me instead of how can I serve God through the church. 1 Corinthians 12 did not give member that word in order to describe what it means to be a part of a club. It gave the word to say, this is what you'll be doing, giving, and sacrificing. You are a member of the body of Christ. That's what true church membership is. When we get that right, we're going to get a lot of other things right, including giving.
Exactly. And it's the serving and the sacrificing that I really want to zoom in for. And what does that look practically for? And again, they need to read your book. I'm a church member, but what would be some practical steps, especially in the lens of giving and serving? What would that look like for a church member today in 2023?
Well, it really becomes a heart intent. You have to ask the question, in order to serve the Lord more fully through my local church, which I say that quite often. I know that we can do ministry outside of the local church, and I know that the local church is not exclusive in the place of ministry, but it is God's plan A for his mission, and he really didn't have a plan B. So it's his primary mission for us, that is through the local church. And if we're truly doing things through the local church, our philosophical lens, our biblical lens, our theological lens will always ask, how can I do for someone else? How can I do for God? And therefore, when we say, for example, how can I give according to God's plan? Or how can I give in a way that shows that I am following him? Things like tithing become minimum strategies instead of goals to achieve. They become foundation instead of that which is we may attain 10 to 15 years from now, because we are there to give to the great God. And this one and only God has given us everything. And so we respond in abundance. And that abundance could be all of our everything, or it could be something a bit less, but for me, it always is foundational with the tithe, and then it grows beyond that.
Absolutely. And you can see that in the early church, the original first century giving church, that was not the ceiling. Tithing was not the ceiling for them. They said, that's the foundation, and we're going to give radically to those in need and to those that were planting churches like Paul. And so I think this is something we need to get back to, certainly. But I also want to talk about another great book that you wrote. In the Autopsy of a Deceased Church, you reference Hebrews chapter 11, which is the Hall of Faith, which many of you may be familiar with. And you said they're not citizens of just this earth, they're long-term residents of another kingdom. And I think that was just a great perspective that we all need to go back to. But what can we learn from them and how to handle our finances with kingdom purpose?
every one of those heroes of the faith in chapter 11 had a perspective that was immediate, that was short term, but well beyond that as well. They had a perspective of things they could not yet see. They knew that they were doing things that would have a lasting influence well beyond their lives. And I don't even know if they could have imagined that we would be reading about them 2,000 years later to see how they were heroes of the faith. But we do know that their concern was for the greater kingdom good beyond what is happening now. And so they weren't concerned, obviously, about immediate satisfaction, immediate gratification. They weren't concerned about recognition. They became heroes of the faith because they had that long-term, even that eternal perspective that motivated them to do what they did, give what they gave, and to do so in a joyous way.
And you also mentioned that they let go of the comfortable. And I think that is, and this ties alongside what you were saying, and I'm a church member, is it's comfortable to be a consumer of your local church. It's comfortable, just to watch your church go by the wayside and die a slow death. But if you do get involved in your local church, and if you do start giving radically to your local church, you can see that it's the Holy Spirit's going to breathe new life into that local church. And so I think you have to let go of the comfortable, like Abraham and like those that are in the hall of faith, because on the other side of what's comfortable is just a closer walk with Christ. And I think that's really exciting, what we're all looking for.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
You've also said that churches, and I found this profound, that churches are growing slower than the communities that are growing around them. And I live in a part of the world here in Florida where Florida has just grown exponentially. And also in Daphne, Alabama was on the top 20 cities in the country, growing nearly 60%. So, over a period of time, which is just remarkable. And the infrastructure is getting squeezed because of it. But then you look at the local church, which is growing, but are they growing at that rate? We don't want to be losing ground in our own towns. And so do you think this is in some way, it's probably many things maybe to blame, but do you think this is in some way as a result of 95% of churchgoers are not tithing?
Well, that is indicative of where they are. That is they being the churchgoers. That is indicative of where their heart is, and that is indicative of where the church is going to go. Now, let me say this. Now, little over 90%, not quite 91, but a little over 90% of all churches in the United States are now declining. And it may be subtle decline, it may be gradual decline, but they are declining. When you quoted me, it was at a time when we could say, okay, there are significant numbers of churches that are growing, but they're growing slower than the community. We want them to reach the community. Now, it gets back to this issue of, do we have a Great Commission heart? The Great Commission heart says go, and it doesn't say stay, and it doesn't say get comfortable. It says go, and it also says go and make disciples. And what are the implications behind that? We are going to be evangelistic. We're going to be serving, and we're going to be unabated givers. We're going to be all of those things. And it is in that obedience where we find our joy. And it is in that obedience where the church gets healthy. Someone was talking to me, well, it was today. I was meeting with a group of pastors, and they said, one of the pastors said, Tom, do you think there's any hope for my church? And he gave me some details of his church, and I won't go into those for obvious reasons. And I just paused for a minute, and I said, let me tell you something. I have seen churches turn around dramatically when one person has decided that they're going to go full for Christ in their giving, in their serving, in their evangelizing, in their teaching. And I said, sometimes that one person is the pastor. Sometimes it's one person in the church. Don't think because your church has dwindled down to 40 or 50 from its 200 to 300, that there's still not an awful lot of hope that is there. But that hope can only take place if it's hope in Christ, and it can only be empowered if it's empowered by Christ.
Amen. I think there's always hope because the Lord can breathe life into dry, dead bones. And I do think that it is relying upon My generation, the millennial generation, after that, Z, to, make sure that we are following the Holy Spirit and we are being catalysts for these, what would be terminal churches to turn the corner. And I think that's only going to start if we see a giving generation within that giving church that is, one, creating disciples, is sharing their faith openly, is living differently than the world, which in my lens would be financially. Your finances shouldn't look like the rest of the world's. If you look at the early church, compared to the Roman citizens of their time, they looked very differently than those that they communed with in regular life. And we should be standing out. And sometimes we want to be so, open, where we just want to make it easy to come to church. And that's great, to make it easy for non-believers to come to church. But when they get in here, they should see how radically we live. And I think that is a challenge to all of us believers. And I love how you talked about that we shouldn't be blaming the secular world for the decline of the church.
No, we should not be blaming the secular world. That is a situation where we should be looking in the mirror and asking why we're not being transformational in culture. If we're seeing culture around us going in a direction that is otherwise, maybe that says something about the church and the people who we are. Look, let's go back to that first century. Let's go back to that time when the book of Acts was written and the explosive growth in Jerusalem and then beyond. The Roman Empire at the time was at its peak. It was powerful. It was ungodly. And the opposition was fatal for many Christians. And yet, what did God do? Well, this is just one example among many. He gave them the Roman roads. And what I mean by that is there was no land roadway at the time, particularly from city to city until the Roman roads were built. They were built for military purposes, for commerce purposes. But God knew what was going on, and he built those. He let them build those roads so the gospel could travel over land. My point is this: there is never a time when we don't have the necessary power of God to reach the people who are around us. If it could happen in the first century, it could happen to us today. And I do love Acts 2 and all the way to verse 47. And you see about them giving as anyone had need. You see about how they dedicated themselves to prayer, to the ministry of the word. You see how they were on fire for the gospel. But then what does it say? And it says those who were watching on the outside were curious. And so they became a part of the church as well. And so the culture wants to see something different, wants to see something that is taking a stand, even though they may not admit it. And this is the opportunity. Andrew, I believe that we're at one of the greatest crossroads of opportunity in the history of our nation. And somebody can look and say, oh, Thom, look at the condition of churches. 92% of churches are under 250 in attendance. Almost 91% are declining. And you're saying there's hope? Oh, yes, I am. I'm saying there's a lot of possibilities. And guess what? Those possibilities will begin to take place when we unleash what we're holding on to. And that includes our ministry, our time, and our money. And when we begin to unleash it and to see what God would do, it is going to be, I'm an obnoxious optimist. I really think that God is about to do some great things. And as long as God gives me a life to live and a breath to breathe, I want to be a part of that. And so we'll see what happens.
You mentioned a few things I want to touch on. Is you mentioned the Roman road. We shouldn't take it for granted. There's a digital roadway. I mean, what's been opened up through digital is the modern day Roman road. And so if anything, there should be a lot of hope that we can get it to the unreached people groups that are about to have internet, that have never had internet and never had the gospel. And we can reach them through a digital roadway. So that's the first thing that came into my mind. And the second thing is what you mentioned about being curious is, we want our giving to be in secret. But when I've had a non-believer friends that have asked me for financial advice, because that's what I do for a living. I have a wealth management firm and a hedge fund that we give advice to families about their finances. And I've had some friends that were unbelievers ask me about how I manage my money. And I say, well, since it's a private conversation, well, half of my money goes to charities. It goes to gospel ministries. I save 20 to 30% and we live on what's left, me and my wife. And they said, why would you do that? And they lean in because they've never heard. They were expecting, someone from Wall Street, someone that manages money for a living, to be greedy. They expect you to be spending everything you make. And when you give them a completely different message, it just makes them absolutely curious why someone would do that. Someone that works so hard for their money would give it away. And then I explained to him, because I believe I have a responsibility to get this gospel out to the world. And let me share you what the gospel means to me. And let me share you this good news. So
I love it. I absolutely love it. And it would only take a few with that open hand strategy to provide all of the funding that we think we need. I'll say we think we need. We could probably do with a lot less for the American church to make an incredible difference. We are supporting through some of our ministry. We have a nonprofit sister organization called Revitalize Network. And one of the groups that we're supporting are in Uganda. We've just started supporting them, and now we have funded the education for a total of 50 pastors. And I was talking to our liaison in Kampala, and he said, Tom, don't just think about what these funds are doing for these pastors to get education. Many of them will not be able to stay in their church for governmental or for some type of ecclesiastical authority unless they get some type of credential. He said the gospel is being carried out because they're getting trained. And I just, I look at our modest gift to them and what we have done, and I'm thinking, this is getting the gospel to East Africa, and we're going to spread it to other countries and hopefully even go across the continent to West Africa. The whole point is this: you unleash what God can do, and you have empty hands, and you just say whatever. God will do miraculous work.
In an autopsy of a deceased church, you mentioned some great remedies for churches that are sick, that, they're sick. They're not deceased yet, but they're sick. Can you share some of them with me, especially for those who haven't read that book? I would love to hear some of those remedies.
Well, let me just give a couple as a starter. For one thing, the church needs to look like the community. Now, what do I mean by that? I don't mean that you have to replicate demographic by demographic in your church. But if you're in a community, I want to go back to one of my early consultations, and it was a long time ago. I could tell you how many years I'm doing it. It wouldn't prove experience; it just improve my age. But it was a long time ago, and it's in St. Petersburg, Florida, well south of you. And I was a pastor, and that pastor said, "Can you come help me find out what's wrong with my church? We're declining." I don't know why he asked me, but I said, "Sure." And I even took off a Sunday to go to his church and go in there on a Sunday. And it didn't take long to see it. It was outside eyes. I said, "Step outside with me." And this was after the service was over. I said, "Look who's in the yards and in the stores around you." And I said, "Do they look like who's in the church?" And he said, "No." I said, "Well, you have a church that does not reflect its community." And we started working on bringing leaders in to do so. So one of the things is you have to be willing to give away sometimes your church and lose control of it to see what God will do with those who are there. So, that is one of the principles that we talk about in autopsy. Another one is just as simple as it can be. It is the more that we're outward focused, particularly focused on evangelism, particularly focused on getting the gospel to the others, the more the other purposes of the church and everything else that we're about, discipleship, ministry, fellowship, worship, prayer, all of those are enhanced the more we are obedient to the Great Commission. If churches would do those two simple things, we gave other remedies, but if they would do those two simple things, I believe God would bless them and they would see an incredible work taking place.
We talk a lot about finances on this show, but you also mentioned taking an audit of how the church spends their resources. Why do you think that's important?
Well, the way the church spends its money is a reflection of its priorities. And sometimes those priorities are not done with malice, but they're done because it's the way that we've always done them. We have been advocating with churches for some time to do a zero-based budget. We know that that's more theory than actual, but we say if you could start your budget from scratch, What do you think it would look like? Because in most of church budgets today, it's what did we do last year? Do we increase it 2% or decrease it 3% or whatever? And we do the budget. We advocate doing a mission-based, zero-based budget where you say, if we were totally obedient to what God wanted us to do for the next year, and if we just had the same amount of funds that we had the previous year, don't even increase them, how would we change the components? We know that can't necessarily take place perfectly. There may be personnel issues, facility issues that you can't change overnight, but it could move you in the right direction. In many of our church budgets, we're in a rote pattern. We're doing the same thing that we've always done instead of asking, what can we do radically different to make a difference for the gospel?
You're exactly right. What we don't want to do is, copy and paste year over year and then wonder why our church is declining because we're not innovating and we're not going back to saying, hey, and I do this when I talk about my own company. So, if we run the organization looking at an audit, we want to say, if I had to start all over again, what expenses would I add back on to the, the cash flow sheet and what would I not? And I think that's really smart when anyone takes an audit, especially if any organization, definitely a church. What are some symptoms that a church is in denial? Because sometimes people don't think they're even sick. What would be some of these signs, especially those churches who have seen their church attendance not rebound after COVID?
Many churches, and maybe we should personify it more and say church members, many church members who are in denial do not like to look at the actual data or information. Here's a story. Did a consultation in North Carolina. It's been some time ago. The church had gone from 800 to 400 in 30 years. Now, you think about how incremental the change would have been over 30 years from 800 to 400. But there were a few members who were part of the founding church. And when we reported to them back the numbers they gave us over a 30-year period, they disagreed with us. And I said, but these are your numbers. And they said, but we have not declined in half. We haven't gone from 800 to 400. We're the same size we always were. It was so incremental that they could not see the changes. And that's one of the things that happens in churches today, Andrew. We see our churches week by week instead of stepping back and saying what has transpired over the last several months, instead of what has transpired over the last year or two. What happened to COVID, it began to expose some areas that were previously incremental. And in that sense, the pandemic has helped create a greater awareness of the need to change. Right now, at Church Answers, we're seeing more requests for consultations and help than we have at any time, not even close in our history. Wow. That is indicative that we are now beginning to have a wake-up call that we really do need help. So your statement was correct, and it was more correct pre-pandemic than post-pandemic because COVID did not create the problems, but they sure did exacerbate the existing problems. And so now we're seeing more and more churches say, I need help. And I don't think it'll be too late for most of them. I think many of them have an opportunity to turn things around.
That's some good news to hear. I also think what COVID may have, showed us is that a lot of families, they went to virtual church, if you will, watching church and thinking, well, this is pretty close to the experience I'm having actually in church because I'm not actually being involved in my church. I'm just listening and I can do that anywhere. And it's like, oh, you've missed the whole point of church, to commune with the saints, to lean on your brother and sister and to disciple one another. And I think that goes back to your book, which I highly recommend reading, is I'm a Church Member, is to be involved. If you feel like you can get the same experience from a virtual church or without a physical body of believers, then sadly, you're mistaken on what a church member really is.
You're exactly right. And attendance and virtual attendance obviously spiked in the early times of the pandemic. Then it began to decline. And here's what's happened. It's all the so-called church members who said that they were going virtual only. They're not there either. the number of people who are said that they would be virtual. In other words, virtual attendance is down dramatically, far more than in-person attendance from its peak. So the virtual crowd has not stuck around. Most of them have gone. Why? Because of the reasons you just said. There was not that in-person discipleship, fellowship, and accountability that comes naturally when we are together.
Absolutely. What are the ways that a church can shift their inward focused expenditures to outward expenditures?
Well, first question we have to ask is, what is an outward expenditure? An outward expenditure, from our perspective, is something that goes beyond the ministries that are there for the church members. Now, I want to pause for just a moment. Ministries for the church members are important. I don't want someone to hear me say, oh, we shouldn't have anything for the church members. We shouldn't have pastoral care. We shouldn't have discipleship. Not at all. But we define them as those that go outside of the church. Then with those that go outside of the church, we have two categories. One are ministries to the community where we really do not expect that it will result in our church assimilating the people that we're serving. There could be a number of reasons why, but you're just doing it because these people are in need of ministry and the church is supposed to do it. For example, the church that I'm a part of in the Nashville area is the church at Spring Hill, where my son is the pastor. And Spring Hill is about 35 miles from downtown Nashville. We have a ministry that we're a part of called Shower Up. And basically, we take showers, mobile showers, to the homeless population in Nashville. That is a ministry that is beyond us, but we don't have any expectation that a homeless person is going to travel 35 miles to assimilate in our church.
Right.
So that's one category. Then the other category are those that we fully would love and expect to assimilate into our church. That particular area is where churches have all but stopped. And that is reaching people who will ultimately become a part of the church, who can then become reproducible disciples themselves. That's why, if you want to explain the decline of the church, those types of outward foci that are on those who could become a part of our church in our community, that has all but stopped in the nearly 400,000 churches in the United States.
That's a shame. That's a shame. The other thing that I would like to highlight is the outward expenditures for mission, especially in unreached people groups, because I think that it matters, like Jesus talks about, where your treasure is, there your heart is also. I think if we put some of those outward expenditures towards unreached people groups, I think it would refocus the local church to say, we are not only trying to reach for families that can come to our church, can't reach to our church, families that will never be able to reach our church, is those unreached people groups. And I think it starts with, you selecting that one person in your life that is, not being reached by maybe a local church that you can disciple, that you can minister to, and you can evangelize, but also as a church as a whole to say, hey, we're going to set aside some of our budget to go to international missions, especially unreached people groups. Because I think if we start putting, again, our focus there as well, it could focus, again, back to evangelism as a whole for the church.
You couldn't be more correct, because basically what you're saying is, let's stick with Acts 1:8. It's a pretty good pattern. So Acts 1:8, we're doing the Jerusalem ministry. We're doing Judea and Samaria, and we're also doing the ends of the earth. And I would be remiss if you had not added that point to it. Yes, global missions, unreached people groups, all of that should be a part of our giving strategy and plan, where not only are the members with open hands with their money, the church is as well. And goodness gracious, what could God do if we began to send the types of money that we're capable of to unreached people groups, to reach the world, to reach those who have not heard the gospel? So your addition to that really gets my Acts 1:8 more in order than the way I described it.
Well, I think what could happen is the Lord might come that much sooner. People ask for the Lord to come. Well, there's some unreached people groups that still need to hear. So
you got it.
In another of your books, Who Moved My Pulpit, you spoke about key KPIs or key performance indicators that churches should be tracking, such as average worship attendance, baptism, average attendance in small groups. Are there any KPIs that have to do with tithes and offerings that you might want to add?
My KPI is probably not the best one, and maybe you can help us to define it better. But we look at weekly per capita giving as the KPI that we use to measure churches, to get them on a common plane. And weekly per capita giving is your average attendance, and it's you divide that by the weekly budget giving. We don't do total giving. So basically, we're asking the question: what does every person who is present, from the youngest child to the oldest adult, give on the average every week? The national average with our research is about $33. So a family of 5, you just multiply that number by 5. And if I'm doing my math right, that's $165 per week for a typical family. So is every person, what do they give on the average per week? So we look at the large numbers. We could probably do better there, but that helps us to have some type of baseline to compare churches. And we recently looked at a church that was like $53, $54 weekly per capita giving, which is well above the national norm. But then we looked at the demographics of the community. It was highly affluent. And so we said, it's good that you have this higher per capita giving, but it's just okay in the area where you are. So we could probably improve on that.
I think there's a lot of room to improve on a lot of those KPIs. I mean, what you just mentioned was a few $1,000s a year for a family of 5. And if you think about that, I mean, that means that family, if you did the 10% minimally being the floor for the tithe, they would have to be, very low into the poverty line. And most of the time, that's just not the case. Those figures just tell us that as a church, we're not giving nearly as much as we can. But I think one KPI that would be a very interesting KPI for you and your church to track is making sure that you're tracking new givers, those who have never given before. And I think that would be a number that I would want to track as a church, to say, how many are we discipling? And this is something they are, again, walking closer to Christ and with their finances that have never before done the year prior. So I think that would be a KPI and a challenge for those who are church leaders and those who are pastors to go back to their local church.
Yeah, I like that. And for the pastors who are listening to this that may say, well, I don't want to go look at the records, just get your financial assistant or secretary to give you those numbers. You don't, if you're uncomfortable digging into them, let someone else do it for you, but they can make those numbers readily available. I love the new giving. I might just do something with that.
Thom, I'd love to ask you some really important questions. To me, is I always love to bring our guests on and ask them some of these tough questions. So are you ready for them?
We'll see. I won't know if I'm ready till you ask it.
If you could write one tweet that could be read by everyone in the world, what would it say?
I would quote my middle son, Art, because he has the tweet that I wish I had written. And I may not get it word by word, but it's something like this: Jesus is alive, and that's all that really matters.
Wow.
Just something that simple. I may not have it perfectly down. One that is quoted that I wrote has been quoted more by anybody else, is when the preferences of the church members are greater than their love for the gospel, the church is dying. So that one, those are two actual tweets. I memorized mine better than I memorized my son's Art's, but his is shorter. But those are the two that I would repeat.
Absolutely. I mean, everything that we believe, we should be pitied and mocked if Christ isn't alive. So I'm banking my whole life on that one.
There you go. There you go. Yep. I love being on Twitter, and then sometimes I need to stay off Twitter. So
Understood. Next is very like it, but do you have a strong belief that really isn't widely accepted by popular culture, or I would add in church culture, because you consult churches so often?
Well, you and I have alluded to one, and that is the issue of the tithe. Believe it or not, I know you know this, Andrew, but many Christians feel like the tithe is an Old Testament concept that has no bearing on New Testament life. Today, I believe that everything in the Old Testament was a foundation and a foreshadowing of that which was to be greater. And so when we talk about the tithe, I'm not hung up on the 10%. I hope I never will be, but I do see it as foundational. That goes definitely contrary to culture. And it sometimes goes contrary to church culture as well. This is another one that we're struggling, trying to figure out what's going on. We have been doing reports called Know Your Church since 1996, 97, and it's surveys of church members. And so we had this longitudinal study where we're able just to see what church members are thinking. Lots of questions we ask them, and we ask them theological questions. These are answers by church members. We are seeing fewer and fewer church members embrace John 14:6, the exclusivity of salvation through Christ.
Scary.
I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. This isn't just a cultural pushback. We're seeing more and more church members who are just really questioning, where is this Jesus the only way? And if Jesus is not the only way, he is not a way at all. And so that one is the one, particularly within the church, that causes me to pause.
Absolutely. I mean, that's so scary. That is very scary. And to go back to what you were saying about it's not popular in church culture, one of the reasons why I wrote the book I did, and I have the Everyday Philanthropist channel to answer questions on tithing and giving, is because I read an article, and I Will Protect the Innocent. It came out of a university, it came out of a seminary that was teaching that tithing was not under the New Testament law, that it was not a command. And I thought, I didn't go to seminary, but I know enough of reading my Bible throughout the year that absolutely it does. When Jesus said that, owe to Caesar what is Caesar's and give to God what is God's, that's exactly what he meant by that. And multiple other times did Jesus reference tithing. So I think oftentimes we just need to get back to our Bible. And I think that would solve both of those issues. If we went back to the Bible and we saw for ourselves that Jesus is the only way, and Jesus was very clear that he said he was the only way. And I think C.S. Lewis was right on, is Jesus cannot be, he's either going to be a liar, a lunatic, or Lord, and he's got to be one of those three. We have to put him into one of those three boxes, and we can't let those boxes ever start to get smudged together, because he didn't give us a choice. He only gave us a choice to say one of the three.
I love it. I love it. Love C.S. Lewis too. Absolutely.
In wrapping this show up, I always want to ask, is there any upcoming events that you want to share with us? Where can we find you over the next few months?
Find me at churchanswers.com. We have a really robust site with a lot of resources, and we have made a commitment that though we will not disregard large churches, that we're going to help what we call the 92% of churches under 250 in attendance. And we're going to work alongside them in the United States, and then our global partners as well, where we're starting out in Uganda. The one thing, well, it's not the one thing, among many things, something that really excites me is we will introduce it in June of 2023. It's called the Hope Initiative. And the Hope Initiative is all about getting the church culture to change to a Great Commission focus. And I could give a lot of details about it, but we've been beta testing this, and we have found that God's really using it. And so we're praying that God will use this initiative to help churches be more Great Commission minded, greater givers, greater ministry oriented, and love their community more. And you can just go to hopeinitiative.com, and all you'll get right now is coming soon. But that's where you'll find out about it, hopeinitiative.com. Excited about that because we've seen it working in beta tests the last year.
Well, I can't wait to hear the results from that as it's launched and rolled out.
Thank you. I'm looking forward to it too.
that's all we have for today's episode, our Rich, Young, and Powerful podcast. That would wrap up today's show. But one thing that would help the two of us is if you would go on to iTunes, Stitcher, Spotify, and leave us a 5-star review so other families and individuals can find this show. And it really does make a difference because they can learn about great organizations. They can learn about church answers, and they can find out more resources by listening to our show. And so be sure to share it. And please do pick up a copy of my new book, The Giving Crisis. The Giving Crisis shares and documents my story from greedy to generosity, and it will share with you tangible techniques that you can give more today. So be sure to pick up a copy of that. And until next time, remember that when a giver gives more, they receive and become more.